Hello and welcome to another lecture for my class, Psychological Testing and Assessment. And boy, is this going to be a big lecture. It didn't start out to be a big lecture, but the more I worked on it, the bigger it got. And it's now actually one of the longer ones I've ever done. But don't worry, if you're watching now, just get ready for a rather lengthy discussion of the interpretation of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition, the WAIS IV from Pearson Psychor. It's long, but it will be, I hope, interesting, and you can take breaks if you want. And I think by the time you're done, if you pay attention and follow along, you'll know quite a bit more how to work with this very interesting and very useful test. And that's, of course, why you're taking the class or why you're watching this video on YouTube. Now, before we get started, just a few points to consider. Interpreting the Wechsler tests can be complicated, and by tests I mean the various products that are published under the Wechsler name by Pearson and Psychor. All of them are complicated tests of ability or achievement or memory functioning or the like. They all capture lots of different information, and there's just a lot of different ways you can organize and parse this information and different theoretical approaches you can apply towards interpreting them. Even if we restrict ourselves to only tests of ability, that is to say tests of intelligence, there's still a lot of different ways that we can slice up this information. Now, I've mentioned before in class, and I'll mention right now, the Essentials series from Wiley. These are references for, among other tests, some of the tests in the Wechsler series. You can see the WAIS, the WIMS, and the WIAT. All three of these are good books, and they provide rather accessible but deep presentations of some particular ways of interpreting these respective tests. So for instance, the WAIS book really emphasizes the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of intelligence and allows you to use the WAIS in a way, or interpret the WAIS in a way that's kind of consistent with that theory. So it's an excellent reference. However, despite the name Essentials, you don't need it. It's not essential for this class, or really not, I would say, essential for interpreting the WAIS. I teach, or I'm going to try and teach in this lecture video, a rather basic approach to interpretation that just emphasizes successive levels of analysis, beginning with the overall intellectual or mental ability, moving on to specific indices of mental ability, and then maybe moving on to particular subtests for those mental abilities. This is basically the same approach that I tend to take when interpreting any test, which is to say I begin at a rather global sort of level for whatever it is that the test is supposed to be measuring, and move to successively more local or fine-grained levels of analysis. And I should say this isn't like my own idiosyncratic way of interpreting the WAIS. It's basically cribbed from the WAIS IV's technical and interpretive manual. So what I'm going to try and lay out here is basically what the out-of-the-box version of the WAIS IV says in terms of how to interpret it. So just to make that clear, if you were to purchase a copy of the WAIS IV, you would see among the other materials that you get this technical and interpretive manual. It's kind of there in the background, and it would provide some guidance on how to do basic test interpretation. It also provides references to, among others, the Wiley's Essentials series, but also other books as well. Because again, the Wechsler tests have been around long enough and have been used long enough that different researchers and kind of theoretical traditions have developed, to some extent, their own ways of using this test. I'm trying to teach a rather basic way. By the way, this picture from my lecture, I found this on eBay. Someone was literally selling a WAIS IV on eBay. Now, to this person's credit, they included in the description of the test the caveat that you had to, upon purchasing it on eBay, prove that you were a graduate of a psychology or education program at a doctoral level. So maybe not a huge violation in ethics, but certainly rather questionable or problematic that someone is selling their copy of this test on eBay. So I don't know, it kind of made me laugh and scratch my head a little bit. So if you're using the WAIS kind of out of the box, you can use the technical and interpretive manual, and you can probably also use some software that Pearson Psychor has developed. In fact, there are a couple different pieces of software. These are designed to make scoring the test easier and also generating interpretations and reports easier. So one piece of software is called Scoring Assistant, and it does what you might guess. It kind of runs the basic math for you and allows you to develop some of the calculations necessary to compute different scores. And you can kind of see a quick description of this up here on your screen. This doesn't ship with all copies of the test, but most of the places that I've ever seen or I've ever worked at, people buy the basic test, but they also spring the few extra $100 for Scoring Assistant. Sometimes people will also purchase Report Writer, which is kind of a stepped up or upgraded version of Scoring Assistant that does all of what Scoring Assistant does, but also generates a kind of an automatic narrative report for you. It produces kind of well, as you can see, comprehensive narrative report with narrative interpretations included. So it gives you a document that has computer generated text interpreting the results for you. And I should say at this point, either Score Assistant or Report Writer are available on, I guess, probably CD-ROM or DVD-ROM format, or you can purchase from Pearson SciCore an online service where you either have a subscription or you pay as you go each time you interpret a test. So likely if you're working at a clinical placement or if you yourself are just out in practice, you would buy a copy of this test for however many hundreds or thousands of dollars it costs, and they're expensive, and you'd probably also pay for some of these assistants just because they're convenient to have. When we talk about this stuff, it's important to remember a few things, a few points from our earlier discussions of ethics. The first is technically Ethical Standard 9.01, Bases for Assessment. And the point here, the reason I'm bringing it up, is any test, whether it's the WAIS or any other test, it's just one source of information. When you are conducting a WAIS, this shouldn't be your only piece of information about someone's mental ability. There should be other information from other tests, from interviews, from observations, and so on. And it's not just simply the case that you administer the WAIS either by hand or on the computer, crunch the numbers, and then just say, all right, well, this person's mental ability is thus, and now we're done. It's part of a comprehensive process that involves multiple sources of information. That's true for the WAIS, that's true for any test. Another point is technically Ethical Standard 9.09, the use of test scoring and interpretation services. This applies, of course, if you're using Scoring Assistant or Report Writer. And it is simply that if you're using one of these services, make sure it's a good one. And arguably, if you're purchasing a service from the publisher and developer of the test, that's about as best as you can get. You know, they probably have the best take on how to properly interpret their own test. But maybe more importantly, at least at this point in the discussion, is that the final interpretation that you give, the final report that you give, is really your responsibility as a clinician. You can't just simply cut and paste from the narrative that the computer spits out and say, well, like, okay, this is right because that's what the computer says, or that's what the scoring service says. You have to use that material that you get from Scoring Assistant or Report Writer to inform your own interpretations. And in all likelihood, if it's pretty typical test administration and you've administered the test properly and the client's a pretty typical person, then what the computer gives you will be more or less what you yourself would have concluded anyway. That's fine. However, there may be situations in which what you get from the computer isn't correct or doesn't quite make sense for the client you're working with, and in those cases, again, it's up to you to use your informed, well-trained, and well-considered clinical judgment to pick what makes sense, to ignore what doesn't, and to give your own informed interpretation of what's going on. So don't just cut and paste. Hopefully you don't need me to tell you that, but there again, I just did. Just one or two more points, really. I've talked a lot about the software at this point, and again, if you're working in a clinical placement or if you're in practice, you likely have this software. Most of the places I've ever been, people pay for it because it's so convenient. However, you don't, strictly speaking, need it. You have all the information you need to do most types of interpretation just out of the box using the books, the scoring and interpretive manual that come with the basic test materials for the basic cheapest price possible. The math that you have to do is trivial. The time it takes to look up information is not really all that much. And unless you're doing a rather tricky assessment with an unusual client or very particular or unusual presenting problem, you don't need to use the software. You may want to use it just because it's convenient, and if you have it, by all means. But don't feel like you can only use this software. That's not the case for the WAIS. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's talk about let's me talk about what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to briefly detail how you complete the record form. That's the piece of, the booklet of paper you fill out as you're administering the WAIS. I'm going to talk about some different levels of analysis, and then I'm going to briefly talk about how to put it all together. So here we go, completing the record form. Well, on the back page of the record form, there are spaces provided for your notes. You can include identifying information, behavioral observations, and other notes that you make while administering the WAIS. Don't forget this stuff. These can provide important clues for interpretation. You also have space to record the test taker's name, age, gender, handedness, your name, and the test location. You can also record, or really you should record, the reason for the referral, the language that the person speaks, elements or aspects of their physical appearance, any indication you have of auditory, visual, or motor problems, any indication that you have about their overall attitude towards testing, their affect, their emotions, or any other unusual behaviors. So don't forget to complete these sections. Often in clinical settings, you're busy, you're pressed for time, it's very easy to skip over this stuff, but you don't want to miss out on important identifying information, because then it could be hard to match a particular test record to the client, and you could get confused or accidentally substitute one person's test for the wrong person. But you can also miss out or forget important pieces of information that could inform your interpretation. Now, if you're using software such as Report Writer, you can actually type this information in, and it will help you to kind of organize it, and it will begin to add that information to your report. So here's this particular client. This is a sample client that Pearson makes available on their website, probably a fictitious or fictionalized real person. And you can see elements of observation which have been typed into the software now appear at the heading of his report. So John was referred for an evaluation by Jack Mills, his physician, secondary to physical difficulties in motor functioning and neurological difficulties, traumatic head injury. So this person is referred because they had a head injury. You can see a couple more things I've highlighted here. This is someone who's achieved a master's degree, also has been diagnosed with brain trauma. So right away, you can imagine that this person is probably someone who's quite educated, someone who's worked full-time as a professional, but who has suffered apparently a fairly severe head injury, which could have some consequences for his performance on this test or for performance on other tests that we might administer. So that stuff's all on the back page. On the front page of the record form, we have a space to fill in the test taker's name and your name. Again, you can actually detach this form from the record form itself, so you got to make sure you put your name on both parts. It's also got a space to calculate the age of the person given the testing date. Now recall that the whole Wechsler system, and indeed most mental ability testing systems, are premised on the idea that people have an expected level of performance given their age. Like if you took a sample of people who are all 30 years old, there would be a distribution of their scores on any test of ability you could give them, and if you then had another person who's 30 years old, you'd expect him to be somewhat like these other people. So the whole thing is getting the age right. If you get the age wrong, all the interpretations are going to be wrong. It's not that hard to get the age right, you just have to calculate it, and the test makes this simple assumption that all months have 30 days just to be kind of easy, so you're not trying to remember, well, are there 31 days or are there 30 days in this particular month. It also, and this is detailed in the administration manual, ages are not rounded up to the month or year, so you're always kind of rounding down. Again, it's not hard to do, but just make sure you do it, otherwise the interpretations can be all screwed up. And as you saw before, if you're using Scoring Assistant or Report Writer, you can type this information in and it gets fit into various spots on a report that begins to get generated on the computer. So here's our guy, John Smithson. He's being examined by someone named Jack Smith. You can see ID number 12345 in case you were wondering if this person was real or not. But important pieces of information like he's right-handed, he speaks English, he's 45 years old and 1 month at the time of testing. This is not a retest. That's important. If someone was being retested within about 6 months or so the last time they were tested, we might expect them to do better because they remember or somewhat practiced at it. This is the first time this guy's encountered this test, so that's good. Elsewhere on the front page, there's a lot of space to do the math. That is to say, to convert the raw scores that people get on the various tests to scaled scores, and then to add those scaled scores together to yield or to compute various indices of mental functioning. So just to try and represent this in sort of a flow chart, you begin with your raw scores. These are the scores that people earn on each of the subtests, and you just compute them typically by adding up the points that the person earns on each of the items for a given subtest, and you get some value. You record those values on the front page, and then looking up in the back of the scoring and administration manual, you can find the appropriate scaled scores. Scaled scores all have a mean of 10, standard deviation of 2, and they are scaled given the person's age. So you look up the table for this person, in this case the person who's 45 years old, and you find out what his raw score on, say, the block design subtest, what it corresponds to in terms of a scaled score, and you put that on the front page. And you can even plot them in a simple graphing area. And then you add up scaled scores to yield composite scores, and you can graph them as well or plot them as well. Pretty easy. Let's take a look at those steps individually. I guess I described them, but I want to go into more detail. The first is calculate subtest raw scores. Again, just sum up the item scores for each of the items on the subtest, and then transfer those numbers to the front page. I have a picture of a calculator here just to gently encourage you to be careful. Don't screw up your addition, even though it's simple, because if you do, everything else will be thrown off. So be careful. Once you're on the front page with your raw scores, you can convert those raw scores to scaled scores. You just have to look up in the appropriate table in Appendix A of the Administration Scoring Manual. You find the correct table on the correct page based on the age of the person, and then just look for the scaled score that corresponds to the appropriate total you got in terms of their raw score for that given test, whether it's block design or matrix reasoning or so on and so on and so on. Now there's an additional trick you can do here if you want. You can convert the raw scores for your given test taker to scaled scores for the reference group. Now the reference group is this group of people who are not divided up by age. Rather, they are a group of people who span ages from 20 years old to almost 35 years old. So they're kind of this age-wise a heterogeneous group, rather than what's usual with WAIS interpretation, where you're comparing each person to a homogeneous, by way of age, group of folks. So why would you want to use this reference group instead of finding the appropriate age? Well, you might want to use this reference group if you're doing research or if you're trying to provide clinical description and you want to know how your particular person, your test taker, your research participant compares to average adults not selected to be the same age as your test taker. So I've got a test taker who's 24 years old. I want to compare him to, generally speaking, adults. So I'm going to use the reference group. Or I might have someone who's in my study or is in my clinic and I've just administered a test. I want to compare her to average adults, not just people his age or her age. I would use the reference group. You don't have to do that. It's an optional thing. It sometimes makes sense to do. In most clinical settings, you probably won't do that because you want to instead do the basic approach, which is to compare each person to a portion of the sample which is all homogeneous with respect to age. So comparing my 45 and 1 month, year and 1 month old person to other 45-year-olds. So assuming you've made a decision, regular approach versus reference group approach, you've converted your raw scores to scale scores. Now you're going to calculate sums of those scale scores, which are going to yield our different indices. So there's verbal comprehension index, perceptual reasoning index. Each of those are just the sum of scaled scores from 3 subtests. And then you can go on and compute the sums for working memory index and processing speed index, which are just other indices on this test. The only difference, important difference I suppose, is that each of those indices are made up of the sum of only 2 subtests. An important point to note here is that, as you hopefully recall from previous class discussions or previous videos we watched, the WAIS and the other Wechsler test, but the WAIS in this case includes optional or supplemental subtests. You can use these supplemental subtests if, while administering a regular subtest, you made a mistake or something went wrong, a fire alarm went off, someone walked into the testing room and interrupted you, and a particular subtest was spoiled. So for instance, imagine you're doing the block design task. The block design task normally is part of the Perceptual Reasoning index, but let's imagine that got messed up for some reason. You might substitute the figure weights subtest in as a supplemental subtest to be substituted in for block design. That's appropriate given the way the WAIS is set up, and you can see that pretty clearly on the record form. Now, a couple important points here. One is you don't add up those subtests unless you're including them as substitutes. So if you, let's say you administered the block design test, and it was just fine, but for whatever reason you decide to administer figure weights or picture completion as additional tests, just because you were curious or you had some extra time or you thought it might be informative. Unless those supplemental tests are acting as substitutes, you shouldn't add them in to your calculation of an index score, in this case perceptual reasoning. If you did, anyone who did those additional tests would have kind of like extra credit. It would make their scores higher, and that wouldn't obviously make a ton of sense. Another important point to note here is that there can only be one substitution per index. So again, this is pretty clear if you're looking at the record form, and you may remember this from class, but the perceptual reasoning index is made up of a set of subtests, and 2 possible substitution or supplemental subtests are possible: figure weights and picture completion. Now, if you ended up using both of those as substitutes, you couldn't compute perceptual reasoning. The test doesn't allow you to do that because the test wasn't developed under the assumption that you'd be using any more than one substitution. Hopefully, if you're doing multiple substitutions, well, hopefully that's not happening, but if it is happening, you're having a pretty unusual test administration, and it's questionable whether that index would be at all meaningful. So just a couple points to keep in mind there. Once you've got your indices, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed, you just add them up to get the full scale IQ. So it's the sum of all the index scores, or basically the sum of 10 subtests. However you add it up, it's going to be the same. Whether you just add up all the scaled scores from 10 of your subtests, no more than one substitution per index, or if you just add up the indexes, assuming you didn't have more than one substitution per index, you get the same point, same total, and that's going to be your full scale IQ score, your overall test or overall estimate of mental ability. So moving on, the next step in this process is to convert scaled sums to composite scores, and in order to do that, you're again turning to the back of the administration scoring manual and looking up numbers in an appendix, or rather one of several appendices. Or if you're using the scoring software, it's doing it for you. Basically what's happening here is you're taking scaled scores, which have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 2, and converting them to composite scores, which have the more familiar mean of 100 and standard deviation of 15. You're also getting from the table or from your software percentile ranks and confidence intervals that express the imprecision of the estimate that you're making for each of these indices. So right now you may be thinking to yourself, wait a sec, estimate, imprecision of estimate, of our estimate, what's that mean? Basically, these confidence intervals are based on the standard error of estimate, or SEE, which is a little bit different than maybe what you're familiar with from other classes where you make confidence intervals based on the standard error of measurement, or SEM. And you may scratch your head for a second and think, wait a sec, this sounds familiar, but what's the difference? Well, don't worry, you know this, we've talked about it before, and as soon as I start explaining it, you'll probably get it right away, so don't stress. Standard error of measurement is a way of expressing the imprecision of a measurement, or how much error is in a measurement, i.e. how much measurement error there is. It's the standard deviation of a distribution of measurements, so like the standard deviation of a distribution of means that you make, or a standard deviation of a distribution of total scores that you make. And obviously if that standard deviation is small, then your measurements are pretty consistent, time after time after time. And if it's large, those measurements are highly variable. Put a different way, this is just a way of describing quantitatively the reliability in the sense of the consistency of a particular instrument, standard error of measurement. The standard error of estimate is the way of describing the imprecision of an estimate, a way of describing the error that is made in prediction. Technically, it's the standard deviation of a distribution of errors, those errors being differences between predicted values and actual values for a group of people. Now, of course, we almost always don't know what the true values or actual values are for those people, what their true intelligence is, or their true, levels of ability are, so on and so on. But given some of the assumptions we've talked about back when we talked about classical test theory, we can estimate the standard error of estimate. We can describe, or we can estimate that standard deviation in that distribution. And if it's a small standard deviation, then that means our measurement's a good predictor. It doesn't tend to lead to predictions or yield predictions that miss by much. If that standard deviation is really large, then our measurement is a bad predictor. It yields, or it leads to predictions which might miss by quite a lot, in either direction, being too high, being too low, and so on. So if standard error of measurement is a way of describing reliability in a sense, standard error of estimate is a way of describing validity, at least in the sense of how valid our instrument is, how good our instrument is at making predictions. And that's important. Standard error of estimate versus standard error of measurement. If you're working through the administration and scoring manual, what you get are confidence intervals based on the standard error of estimate. These are ranges around values for a true composite score. So you say a person's composite score is 100 for a particular index, let's say working memory index, and you get a confidence interval around that that describes how precise or imprecise that estimate is. Working with Scoring Assistant, you get confidence intervals based on standard errors of measurement, ranges around which around the measured values where we think the true composite score lies. Now, the difference here is a little bit subtle, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure why one approach, that is to say the book, works with one calculation, standard error of estimate, and the other, the software, works with standard error of measurement. Just suffice it to say that they do. They're different that way. And there is a subtle distinction there, but not one that practically speaking makes a ton of difference when you administer and interpret this test. So anyway, I've described this process. If you're looking at a record form, for the WAIS, you can probably follow along with what I'm saying. But if you're not, or if you're just content to watch the screen, you can see here a summary of scores that we get using the Scoring Assistant, and it clearly makes the whole process a lot faster because you don't need to flip back and forth looking for different appendices. But what you can notice here are for our different indices: verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed, full scale, general ability, which I'll talk about later. We have a sum of scaled scores, and then we have a composite, which is going to be in our familiar metric of standard deviation of 15 and mean of 100. We get percentile ranks, we get confidence intervals. Note the little footnote that says that those confidence intervals are based on overall average standard errors of measurement. That's just because we're using Scoring Assistant. We also get kind of a qualitative description to correspond to the idea of whether this is a high average, low average, or average level of performance on those different indices. So easier, quicker, and not that hard to interpret. Also on the front page, assuming you're working on paper, even if you are filling in the computer, you should really also be entering in values on your record form on the page. There's area to plot profiles for the composite scores, and this is useful because it'll help you to decide whether or not you can interpret the full scale IQ, and you can make that decision partly based on observing whether there's a lot of scatter in the different indices. So clearly, if someone tends to elevate each of the indices, let's say above average on all the indices, then it's pretty reasonable to think that their full scale IQ is similar. It's just above average. They're pretty consistently high on everything. And if someone unfortunately was below average on all their indices, it would be pretty straightforward to interpret their full scale IQ as being, well, they're low average or below average on everything. If there's a lot of scatter, it may be difficult to make sense of full scale IQ because someone's very good in one index of mental ability but perhaps very poor in another. We don't like the idea of sort of averaging across a lot of scatter. We might look for other options in terms of trying to give our best estimate or our best indication of overall mental ability. So to give you a picture of what that looks like, this is again from Scoring Assistant, and it's similar to the type of plot that you can make with paper and pencil using the record form. You can see here that this particular person is above average for verbal comprehension, below average for perceptual reasoning and working memory, and average for processing speed. Now there's a fair amount of scatter among these indices. One is above average, two are below average. We may be suspicious, or we may be hesitant to interpret full scale IQ. If you look over on the graph there, you can see that full scale IQ is ever so slightly below average. That might be a reasonable estimate of this person's mental ability, but it might not given the scatter of the various indices that make up full scale IQ. Also interesting to note, the error bars are much smaller for full scale IQ than they are for the other indices. Well, that's just because it's made up of more information. All the subtests go into full scale IQ, and only portions of all the subtests, groups of them, go into the various indices. So larger error bars. So we can plot the indices. We can also plot the subtests on the front of the record form, and this can be useful too for basically the same reason. We use the scatter in the indices to decide whether we can interpret the full scale IQ, and we use scatter in the subtest to decide whether or not we can interpret the indices themselves. So if there's very little scatter, it's relatively easy to interpret the composite score for an index. So if a particular person does well on all the verbal comprehension subtests, it's pretty straightforward to interpret their verbal comprehension index. On the other hand, if they do very good on one but really terrible on another, you might start to wonder, gosh, is it all that meaningful to talk about this person's verbal comprehension given how all over the map they are on the various subtests that make up that composite index score. Same principle. Little scatter, easy to interpret the index. Lots of scatter may be more difficult and may also suggest strengths and weaknesses, which is something we'll get to much later in this lecture. To represent that pictographically, again, you could do this paper and pencil style, and you should do this paper and pencil style on the record form, but here's what it looks like on Scoring Assistant and Report Writer. You can see the different indices here: verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, pardon me, working memory, and processing speed, and you can see the scatter of tests, subtests within those different indices. So on verbal comprehension, our particular person is kind of above average on all three of the main tests. There's comprehension is added in there as well. He's average on that. Mean is 10, of course. On perceptual reasoning, he's below average on everything. Working memory, he's below average on everything. And on processing speed, he's got this weird split where he's above average for simple search and below average for coding. And that's kind of unusual or kind of interesting to look at. Note here, I kind of mentioned this already, that the test user, the test administrator, administered the comprehension subtest, which is a supplement. It's not clear why he or she did this, at least based on the information that Pearson provided on the website, because there's no record of assuming that this is based on an actual real administration. There's no record of one of those subtests in verbal comprehension being spoiled, so it doesn't seem like that comprehension subtest is meant to sub in for vocabulary or for similarities or for information. So again, not clear why they did this. Maybe it was just to get more information about the person's verbal ability. But importantly, and kind of as I mentioned before, the fact that it's there, it shouldn't be added in when computing the person's verbal comprehension index. We already have enough information from the three main subtests: similarities, verbal comprehension, vocabulary, and information. We don't need to also add in comprehension unless comprehension was acting as a substitute. Okay, what do we make of all this? We've done all this math, or we've had the scoring assistant do all this math for us, and we've made some tables and we made some graphs, and we probably feel kind of satisfied with ourselves, but we're maybe wondering, what do we make of all this? Well, if you turn over the record form onto the second page, assuming you haven't detached it, or if you have detached the first page of the record form, you just flip over to the back. You've got this rather lengthy sort of spreadsheet looking page for different analyses. There are lots of different analyses you can do, comparisons between different indices, between different composites, between different subtests even. You don't need to do all of these. You have to really try to define the analyses you do based on the scope of testing. What was this person's reason or referral for? Are there particular hypotheses you're trying to test for this client? That should be guiding you. You don't just sort of willy-nilly test everything or compare or analyze everything. You could, but it would be a lot of work and probably not worth the effort. Here's some ideas. I'll talk about this a lot further on in the lecture. One thing you can do is look at discrepancies. At a composite level, you can look at comparisons between different indices, verbal comprehension versus perceptual reasoning. You can actually even do discrepancy analysis at a subtest level, comparing one subtest to another. Like in the case of this particular person, if you were intrigued by that apparent split in processing speed between his above average performance on symbol search and his below average performance on coding, you could test whether that difference is statistically significant, and you could get some indication of how rare it is in the sample that was used to norm the WAIS. That could be interesting for you. You can also look at strengths and weaknesses, and that is just simply comparing individual subtests to overall abilities. So if this person's verbal comprehension is pretty high, is it high even relative to their performance on all the other subtests, or there some other way of describing their overall ability? Does it emerge as a specific strength for this person or a specific weakness? And you can also do what's called process analysis, which I liken to kind of neuropsych testing, where you look at very specific patterns of errors that are made on several of the subtests and try to make inferences about problems that the person is having kind of neurocognitively processing information on the test. It's beyond the scope of this lecture. I'll touch on it very late in this lecture, but it's largely beyond the scope of this lecture. And in order to do it properly, you really need some more resources, some of which Pearson and Psychor will happily sell to you, or which you can find in other support texts like the Essentials series. So again, there's a lot you could do on this record form. There's spaces and boxes for all of this stuff that I've just put on the screen and more. How do you decide which analyses to do? Well, here's where I'm going to suggest an approach that's similar to that which I suggest for most tests, which is you pursue successive levels of interpretation, beginning at a rather general or global level and moving to successively more specific levels of analysis, and kind of do the work that way and even kind of interpret the results of that work in that same sequence. Well, let me show you how this all works, and no, it's not nearly as complicated as this picture might suggest. We're going to begin with overall level of ability. which is best estimated by either the full-scale IQ or the general ability index. And maybe we're going to do some discrepancy analyses at that level. Then we're going to move to the index level, the major indices like verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, maybe do some discrepancy analyses there, and then maybe we're going to move on to the subtest level and look at specific strengths and weaknesses or other types of analyses. So with that in mind, let's begin at this overall level. And here what we're trying to do is report and describe the overall intellectual ability that this person has. We're trying to give the best estimate that we can of their general intelligence. Well, what is the best estimate? Almost always it's going to be the full-scale IQ, for the reason that this is based on the most information. It's based on a combination of all the subtests on the overall test. It's a combination of all the scaled scores on all the subtests, and you can look up full-scale IQ in the Appendix A7, I'm sorry, in Table A7 of Appendix A in your Scoring and Administration Manual. Sometimes the best estimate of overall ability is the General Ability Index. This is kind of like an alternative to the full-scale IQ that's based only on verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. You know, it's as simple as saying, what if instead of combining verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed, full-scale IQ, we only combine verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. And that's, you can see here, Table C1 of Appendix C provides the appropriate source to look up General Ability Index given a particular person's sum of scaled scores. General Ability Index, as you could guess based on how it's computed, is less sensitive to the effects of working memory and processing speed because working memory index subtests and processing speed subtests are not included when it's calculated. It de-emphasizes these processes or these abilities, working memory and processing speed, in the estimation of overall ability. It's like, what if you just tried to estimate someone's overall ability without drawing heavily on how good their memory was, or without drawing heavily on how good their processing speed was? Now, to be clear, it doesn't remove the effects of these cognitive abilities, because all cognitive abilities, as far as we can tell, are interrelated and correlated. So by ignoring these indices, working memory and processing speed, it's not like we subtract them out entirely, we just de-emphasize them. So one way to interpret General Ability Index is to say, you know, it's like, what is the person's level of mental ability if we don't include, or at least we don't emphasize, memory and processing speed? Another way to think about it, which is kind of equivalent, would be to say, what's this person's overall ability if their working memory and their processing speed were kind of similar in level to their verbal ability and perceptual reasoning? If you know, they were on the same level as those kind of primary mental abilities, what would the person's overall ability look like? So when would you use General Ability Index instead of full-scale IQ? Well, probably you'd use it in situations where there were interesting or just weird discrepancies between some of the indices on the test, particularly between kind of your primary indices, verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, and these, I'm tempted to say, kind of secondary indices, working memory and processing speed. So if, for instance, working memory was very different from verbal comprehension, or if processing speed was very different from perceptual reasoning, or if working memory and processing speed were really different from each other, or if there was a lot of difference between the subtests that made up those indices, you might say, I would prefer to kind of focus on verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. I'm going to use General Ability Index as my way of doing that. Again, because General Ability Index is less sensitive to working memory and processing speed than is full-scale IQ. You know, you put another way, you might say, well, let's just use General Ability Index when working memory or processing speed are odd. If these indices are low, if we have a feeling like maybe they're dragging down the overall estimate of intellectual ability, or when the performance on the subtests that make those up are really inconsistent, which suggests that those indices, working memory, processing speed, are themselves rather unreliable. When might this happen? Well, it can happen for all sorts of reasons, but some of the clinical conditions are those that are associated with low attention or with memory problems, things like ADHD or Asperger's syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, head injuries, which might be relevant in this particular case, and so on. If you had reason to believe that there's a problem with working memory or a problem with processing speed, you might decide to use General Ability Index instead of full-scale IQ. By the way, here's an interesting point. There is a calculation you can make on the WAIS called Cognitive Proficiency Index, which is kind of like another alternative measure of overall mental ability, except this time it's based only on working memory and processing speed. It's kind of like the opposite or the anti-General Ability Index. General Ability Index is based only on verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. Cognitive Proficiency Index is based only on working memory and processing speed. Truthfully, I don't think I've ever seen someone use Cognitive Proficiency Index. I'm sure there are some good reasons to out there. Just search the literature, but be aware it exists. Someone figured out that you could calculate it. So let's bring this back around for just a second. Let's imagine you've administered the test, as someone has in this kind of case of this fictitious client or test taker here. You can compare full-scale IQ and General Ability Index by conducting a discrepancy analysis to see just is there a statistically significant difference between the scores that this person has on those two indices. And you can see how common that difference is in the normative sample. That is, how if the difference is statistically significant, is it still something that is fairly frequent in the normative sample, or is it fairly infrequent in the normative sample? And you can do that by just looking up the appropriate tables in Appendix C, or of course, Scoring Assistant will do it for you. In the case of our client here, you can see full-scale IQ and General Ability Index are both average. And you can also see here, and this is kind of interesting, just to note, bit of foreshadowing, that verbal comprehension is higher than all the other indices. So, are these things significantly different? Well, full-scale IQ and General Ability Index are not statistically significantly different. You can see the difference between them is rather modest. We get the critical value for that t-test. We get a p less than 0.05 significance test for it, and we get a base rate for that difference in the overall sample. So what we're looking at here in that bottom line is, yeah, there's a difference of 3 points. That's not significantly different. It's, I guess, maybe close, but it doesn't quite make the mark. And in any case, approximately 30% of the sample shows differences of that size. So even if it was statistically significant, it's not rare. 1 in 3 people will have that magnitude of a difference between their respective full-scale IQs and General Ability indices. We can also see here that in the discrepancy analysis, and this kind of gets us a little into the second stage of our test interpretation, but again, as a bit of a preview, you can see that verbal comprehension index is significantly higher than the other indices here. So when verbal comprehension index is compared to perceptual reasoning, there's a difference of 28 points. That's quite large compared to the critical value. That's statistically significant in terms of its difference, as is the difference between verbal comprehension and working memory, as is the difference between verbal comprehension and processing speed. Now I said that that's a little bit of a preview because really that's the second stage of analysis where we move from general abilities to specific indices, but I'm bringing this up now to raise, I think, kind of an interesting point. Sometimes verbal comprehension index is the best indicator of overall intellectual ability. That's true on the WAIS. It's been true on pretty much every intelligence or mental ability test almost ever made. Verbal ability is the most associated with little g. And so it may be the case for this person that his full-scale IQ is perhaps not all that interpretable because of his apparent split between verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, the scatter among the indices. We might start to wonder if, gosh, this person's verbal ability might be their best measure of their overall intellectual ability. And indeed, that is more or less what our report writer suggests in its little automatic narrative summary. So I've highlighted a couple portions here, but the basic gist is that John, perhaps because of his traumatic injury, is having some motor difficulties that have in all likelihood slowed or impaired or depressed his performance on some of the tasks associated with the perceptual reasoning index. However, his verbal abilities are relatively unaffected by this, and you can see if you look in the second highlighted region, sort of further down to the bottom, John's general cognitive ability therefore is best estimated by his performance on the verbal tasks. His verbal reasoning ability is high average range and is approximately above that of 79% of his peers. So we get our percentile for this fellow. And that kind of makes sense, given that we know from his background that he is someone who has an advanced degree. So he's clearly someone who had some fairly above average ability, to go to grad school and be successful and retain a career. So it's probably the case that previous or pre-morbid to this injury, he would have been high average on most or even all of his indices, but perhaps as a result of his injury, he's got decreased performance in one or more of his indices, probably perceptual reasoning and working memory, and that's kind of dragging things down, making that full scale IQ less of an accurate estimate of what his overall mental ability should, in a sense, be. Now, the important point here to make, and I've maybe drifted away from it a little bit, is that usually the most important thing you can do with the test of mental ability, like the WAIS, is get a good estimate of overall ability level. So your first job really is to decide what's the best way of representing this person or estimating this person's overall mental ability, their intelligence. Is it full-scale IQ? Usually that's going to be the best estimate. Maybe it's general ability index. That might be the case. It's not here because there's not a huge split between perceptual reasoning and there's not a huge split between verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, and as compared to working memory and processing speed. And you can see that the difference between full-scale IQ and general ability index is not that big. But for some people that's going to be the best estimate, and in some cases it might be as simple as verbal comprehension index. And here, based on the client's presentation, what we know about his background and what his referral question was, is probably the case, or at least you can make a reasonable argument, that verbal comprehension, his above average ability in that domain, is really the best representation of his overall mental abilities, rather than saying it's, he's average. Although you could argue it the other way as well. But however you do, the basic, first question you need to ask is, what's this person's overall mental ability? How can I best describe or estimate it? Now, once you've done that, you can move down to the index level. And I've kind of already started doing this because I wanted to highlight how different this guy's verbal comprehension was from his other indices. But you can spend more time at that level of analysis now. Once you've kind of satisfied your curiosity about this person's overall mental ability, intellectual ability, let's now look at these different indices or facets of his intellectual ability. So here what our job is to report and to describe these different indices. If you spent time in psychology, especially clinical psychology, it may be fairly obvious to you what perceptual reasoning is, but to most other people, especially to the client himself or herself, that may not be obvious. So part of your job is to be able to describe what these facets of intellectual ability are. And sometimes it can be important to offer interpretations about those abilities or about discrepancies between those abilities. And that's especially true if there's a lot of variability in those indices. If someone is kind of high on all indices, it's maybe not all that important to discuss whether or if, or probably not, there are differences between them, or if they're really low on all those abilities. But if someone like our guy here has quite a lot of scatter, it can be interesting or even important to talk about how big that scatter is and what it might mean or why it might have come about. So with that in mind, let's take a quick look at some of these indices. Well, there's verbal comprehension, which you know from class and from reading and from other videos, is just our way of representing verbal concept formation, to some extent reasoning, and to a large extent knowledge, crystallized intelligence. Perceptual reasoning involves spatial reasoning, fluid reasoning or intelligence, and also visual motor integration, the ability, particularly on the block design task, to manipulate things in the world so as to solve puzzles. Working memory is perhaps a little bit easier to understand. It's just that. It's the ability to retain and, to a limited ability, transform information, digits forward, digits backwards. There's a little bit of mental manipulation there that is necessary. Maintain information and do some basic work with it in real time. Processing speed reflects your ability to quickly scan and discriminate and acquire bits of visual information. Now, I think I already showed this table from the scoring assistant and report writer, but I'm going to show it again just because it highlights that this particular person has high average ability on his verbal comprehension index, and he's got low average ability on his perceptual reasoning and working memory index. And as you can see here as well, his processing speed index is quite average. It's exactly average, which is good for him. The narrative report from the report writer gives us basically the same information. That his verbal comprehension emerges as an area of relatively high performance. You can see here that it's about the 79th percentile for his peers, and you get a confidence interval there. Perceptual reasoning is an area of relatively low performance. He's only at the 14th percentile. And working memory is also an area of low performance. He's at about the 18th percentile. So you can see here we get a table from Scoring Assistant, and if we've paid the extra money for Report Writer, we get some narrative that kind of explains this in fairly straightforward language. I mean, depending on your client, you might want to you probably would omit some of the numbers here, but you would use the narrative descriptions, the qualitative descriptions like high average and low average. Now, at this index level, we can describe whether any of these apparent differences are statistically significant. And as I've kind of mentioned before, we could say, are they statistically significant, and also how common are they in the normative sample, given the person, either based on the overall sample or based on the person's ability level by group. So is this difference statistically significant, and how common or how rare it is? And there are ample tables provided in Appendix B to look up all that information. Important points to note here is that we're asking kind of several different questions all at once, and they're each worthy of some attention. Are these differences statistically significant? Well, significant differences do occur, but they're not always rare or even meaningful. So is a difference statistically significant? That's one question. How common is that difference? Well, clearly commonly large differences are not very interesting. If many people, or even a majority of people, have a particular difference between two indices, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning maybe, then that's not that unusual, and maybe it's not that important. And how meaningful is this difference? Does it make sense given the test taker's concerns and presentation? So all these things are kind of bound up together, and it can be sometimes a little bit difficult to disentangle them. Let's take a look here at more of our tables from Scoring Assistant. You can see here's verbal comprehension, and here's perceptual reasoning and working memory. And in the analysis, we see that verbal comprehension is statistically different, significantly different, I should say, from both perceptual reasoning and working memory. And that makes total sense, because verbal comprehension is high average, and perceptual reasoning and working memory are both low average. So you can see that the size of those differences, you can see they're quite large compared to the critical value for the t-test. The differences are significant using our familiar p less than 0.05 criterion, and those differences are rare in the overall sample. So in the overall sample of people, it's uncommon to see differences that large. So here's verbal comprehension, and here's processing speed, and here the difference is still significantly different, although it's just barely bigger than that critical value. So you can see there highlighted. So it meets the threshold to be called statistically significant using the familiar p less than 0.05 criterion, but it's fairly common in our overall sample. More than 22% of all people have a difference of 12 points between their verbal comprehension and their processing speed. So maybe that's not as interesting to us. Okay, now we can take a look at perceptual reasoning and working memory as compared to processing speed. And we can see here that those differences are also statistically significant, but they're less common than is the difference between verbal comprehension and processing speed. So a little bit less common, statistically significant, still fairly common though, 14% of the sample, 17% of the sample. I'm kind of dancing around this point here, so let's introduce a basic rule of thumb that you see in the WAIS scoring and interpretive material. The rule of thumb being that if a difference occurs in less than 15% of the sample, it's probably unusual. And using that rough criterion, if I was reviewing this test for real, the only differences I'd be particularly interested in are the differences between verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, and between verbal comprehension and working memory, because those are quite different and they're quite rare in the overall sample. So you can see here our differences again. Verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning discrepancy is significant, and it's rare, and this is important. It kind of makes sense given the test taker's concerns and presentations. You see a bit of that here in our summary that we get from report writer. His motor difficulty may have impeded his performance on nonverbal tasks, and thus his verbal abilities are the best estimate of his overall intellectual functioning. So we have a reason why there might be this difference. It's large, it's statistically significant, it's rare, and it kind of makes sense given who this client is. He's had this injury which we know already probably affected his motor performance, which is going to impair him disproportionately on perceptual reasoning tasks, especially block design, as compared to verbal comprehension tasks. So the important point here is, kind of as we saw earlier, verbal comprehension index may be a better estimate of overall intellectual ability than full-scale IQ, in the sense that perceptual reasoning may be kind of dragging down the estimate. Like, let's imagine that all we knew about this guy was verbal comprehension index. We might judge that he's got kind of a high average level of intellectual ability. You know, he's almost a standard deviation above the mean in terms of his IQ. If we were to look at his full-scale IQ, he looks more like he's average. Well, part of the reason for that is perceptual reasoning and actually also working memory are kind of dragging him down. So whether full-scale IQ is now his better estimate of his ability or verbal comprehension is the better estimate, it's not like there's one definitive answer, but certainly some suspicion that verbal comprehension is the better index or better estimate, especially if we were thinking like, what was his intellectual ability before this accident happened? It was probably closer to his verbal comprehension high average than it is his full scale, just average level. So again, just to highlight this even further, I've kind of said this, but it's nice to see that it gets repeated or reflected in the report writer. We know that he has an advanced degree. We know that he's worked full-time as a professional, and it's only been fairly recently because of this trauma that he started to have problems. So it kind of makes sense that he's got some discrepancy between the way he probably should be in terms of his overall ability and how he's currently performing. Now you might be asking briefly, or you might think back to earlier in the lecture and say, well, what about that general ability index? Should we pay any attention to that? General ability index would remove the effect, or would minimize the effect of working memory on our estimate of overall intellectual ability. But it wouldn't remove the influence of perceptual reasoning. So if all he had was memory problems, like let's say perceptual reasoning was pretty average or even high average, but he had some sort of deficit in working memory, which of course he does, we might make an argument that general ability index is the better estimate because it gets rid of that problem or minimizes that problem. But in this case, he's got deficits in both working memory and perceptual reasoning. So actually, full-scale IQ and general ability index are pretty similar to one another, as you can see right here. So just to note this one more time, verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning indices are significantly different, and it kind of makes sense given the client's presentation. And it's also interesting to note that the working memory and verbal comprehension index is also significant and rare. The narrative that we get from a report writer kind of notes this or hints at this as, his verbal comprehension is above average, his working memory is below average, but it doesn't really offer us a lot of interpretation. So it's not the case that the report writer knows all and kind of magically gives you all the information you need. It gives you hints, it gives you suggestions. And you can make an argument that if we assume verbal comprehension is the best index of the test taker's mental ability, especially pre-accident, then we might wonder whether his memory is significantly lower than we would expect given that high level of overall ability. So maybe not just perceptual reasoning, but also working memory are kind of influenced by this accident and perhaps dragging down his performance, making his overall or full-scale IQ look lower than really, in a sense, it should. So if we have this idea, this hypothesis that maybe this guy's working memory is lower than it really should be, perhaps because of this accident that he's had, we might be tempted to go take a look at the individual subtests and see if we can find sort of further information for evaluating this hypothesis. And we might especially focus on this interesting supplemental test that was administered, Comprehension, and note that it's lower, it's in the average range compared to all the other verbal comprehension subtests. Does this mean that this subtest requires more or different types of memory than maybe the other verbal comprehension index subtests? That might be, but we have to be a little bit careful at this point. I'm kind of hinting at something I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the lecture. And that something is just speculation. It's fairly easy to come up with speculative interpretation about how index level discrepancies occur, or why they've occurred. So for instance, in this case, we note that there's a difference between verbal comprehension and working memory. It's easy to sort of begin to speculate why that is. It's probably because he's had this accident that's probably affected his memory, and it's easy to connect these ideas to subtest level discrepancies, like, maybe comprehension test is different than the other verbal comprehension index subtests. You have to be a little bit careful about this and be careful to consider other sources of information. Our goal is to kind of think like a scientist practitioner here, emphasis on scientist, and not just willy-nilly make speculations. Because if we do, we can easily end up kind of misleading ourselves, or even worse, misleading our client. The important point to make here is that at the index level, interpreting indices is important. It's often important. We almost always want to describe what these indices are, and we sometimes want to talk about discrepancies between them. If there are significant, rare, and especially meaningful differences between, let's say, verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, and so on and so on. But it's easy to come up with speculative interpretations that may not be particularly reliable or valid. So we have to be a little bit careful. The further down we go, the more fine-grained our analysis gets, the more we have to kind of caution ourselves against being speculative in our interpretation. But let's assume we're still pretty comfortable with what we're saying. This guy's got average or maybe above average level of overall ability. He's got some interesting discrepancies between some of his indices, particularly between verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning and working memory. Now let's see if we can move on. And we move on to the subtest level, where we can examine strengths and weaknesses, and we can also do a whole raft of other types of subtest analyses. So the first thing to focus on here are these strengths and weaknesses. And I've mentioned these before, but now it's time to kind of explain really what they mean, at least in the context of the Wechsler tests. And it's a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that people are obviously better at some tasks and worse at others. So what we can do is we can report and we can describe whether these strengths and weaknesses exist and whether they're clinically interesting or meaningful. Again, we have to be a little bit careful about speculative interpretations and try and use good evidence to support our interpretations. How we do this, though, is we compare each of our subtests to some estimate of overall mental ability. And we have basically two choices here. One is we can say, does a given subtest differ from the average of all the subtests? Is it much better? That would be a strength. Or is it much worse? That would be a weakness. Or we can compare for the verbal comprehension subtests, a particular test to the average of just the 3 tests that make up verbal comprehension. Or for perceptual reasoning, we can compare a perceptual reasoning subtest to just the average of the 3 tests that make up perceptual reasoning. And in the administration scoring manual, there are tables for this, of course. And in the scoring assistant, the calculations are just done for you. Which estimate should you choose? Should you go with overall full-scale IQ, the average of 10 tests, or should you use a specific average just for verbal comprehension or just for perceptual reasoning? Well, generally speaking, you use full-scale IQ. You use the overall average of 10 tests because it's the greatest amount of information and it's probably going to be the most reliable and valid. However, you might not do that if you already know that there are pretty big discrepancies between the indices. That may mean that the mean of all the tests is not a good estimate of someone's overall ability, and that it's better to compare each test, each subtest, to its respective index. Important to note here, though, that if you do that, you can't do any analyses with working memory or processing speed, strengths, and weaknesses, because those those indices are only made up of 2 subtests. So you can't really, that's not enough information. You can't compare one subtest to an average of 2 subtests, one of which is itself. That's just not enough information to work with. So if you use that more focal approach, you can't do those analyses, which you might want to, or you might not. So if we take a look at Scoring Assistant and Report Writer, we can see that block design emerges as a weakness. The score on that subtest is significantly lower than the mean of all the subtests. You can see that that difference is, again, statistically significant, and it's relatively rare in our sample, and it kind of makes sense given the person's overall performance, and it makes sense given what we know about their medical history of having sustained this injury. We take a look at the graph of their performance on the different subtests. We can see the block design is quite a bit lower than all the other subtests. And again, this kind of makes sense. As compared to all the other subtests, block design requires a lot more motor activity than the other perceptual reasoning subtests, or indeed than any of the other subtests. So it kind of makes sense that this person's performance, given his injury, is a little bit low. If we take a look at Scoring Assistant and Report Writer, we see that vocabulary and information emerge as relative strengths. The performance on these subtests is significantly higher than the performance average for all the subtests, although it's worth noting that the base rate of this difference is pretty high for vocabulary, so maybe that's not that interesting, at least not to me at least. Although it's worth saying that these differences make sense given the test taker's high level of education and high level of job performance. One thing you may be wondering though at this point is, why are we using the average of all the subtests? Recall that earlier we noticed that there was a significant discrepancy between verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. So if this is the case, why aren't we rather comparing verbal comprehension subtests to the average of just those subtests and perceptual reasoning subtests to the average of just those subtests, as I advised before? Whoever ran this analysis in Scoring Assistant and Report Writer didn't make those choices. He or she instead chose to compare to an average of all the subtests, and that's not what I would have done. But maybe the person did this so as to be able to make analyses of strengths and weaknesses in working memory and processing speed, which would otherwise have been unavailable to him or unavailable to her. If that's the case, it's unsurprising perhaps to see that digit span emerges as a weakness. And again, we couldn't get this analysis if we weren't using the average of all the subtests. Note again though, the base rate for this this weakness is relatively high, and it's not very interesting, I would say, to me, but at least it's consistent with the test taker's concerns and his presentation, that is, this injury that he sustained. And if we go and take a look at the profile plot for all the subtests, we can see that overall this test taker has this this weakness in perceptual reasoning and in working memory. We can also note here, if we look at processing speed, that the coding part of processing speed requires more working memory than does the symbol search part. There's more to do well on that task. You have to maintain more bits of information in mind. So maybe that explains this interesting split that we noticed before. There's a little bit more working memory load for that. There's also a little bit more motor movement. You have to move your hand across the page more than you do for symbol search. So maybe the fact that coding in processing speed is low and symbol search is high, which is kind of weird and hard to explain, is just because working memory and perceptual reasoning load up a little bit more on processing speed for coding than they do on symbol search. So that kind of makes sense as well. Some important points to notice here, or some to reflect on, is that interpreting strengths and weaknesses can be interesting, it can be informative, but as I've said a few times already, we have to be careful. First, we have to make a decision about which estimate of ability to compare to, that is, overall average of all the subtests, or just the average of perceptual reasoning subtests, or the average for verbal comprehension subtests. That's a decision we have to make based on our judgment of what's the best index of overall ability or estimate of overall ability. Then we have to ask, are any differences or strengths and weaknesses we observe, are they statistically significant? Are they rare enough to be interesting? And importantly, are they meaningful given what we know about the test taker? And of course, the further down you go, the more fine-grained your analysis gets, the easier it is to come up with speculative interpretations that may not be reliable or valid. So just gently caution yourself against that tendency. Now we're at the subtest level. We're really kind of down here. We've done strengths and weaknesses. We're at the subtest level. We can do pairwise comparisons between subtests. The administration scoring manual gives you tables in the Appendix B to basically compare any subtest to any other subtest, which may be sort of useful. So for instance, some test guides, like the Essential series, give fairly specific guidance on how to interpret the differences between, let's say, a digit span and arithmetic differences. If they're significant, may be informative about working memory performance. There's research to back up some of this rather nitty-gritty type analysis. But for most of us, this stuff isn't necessary. Without specific guidance or without specific reasons for doing these analyses, I would generally discourage them, because it's easy to find differences that may be significant, statistically speaking, because remember, all tests have measurement error, but can be difficult to interpret as meaningful or not. Like, yeah, you may find, in the case of this one particular subject, it may be the case that we want to see is that difference on processing speed between symbol search and coding statistically significant. It almost certainly is. What does that mean? Well, we have a pretty good explanation for that, but we could easily come up with others, and it's difficult at this low level, or this fine-grained level of analysis, to understand always how to interpret differences between subtests. To continue on, at the subtest level, we can do process analysis. It's really a whole set of analyses that look at particular types of errors that can occur on block design, digit span, and letter number sequencing task. Letter number sequencing being a supplemental task for the working memory index. There are tables in Appendix C of the Administration Scoring Manual that go through some of how you can do this. This is kind of a neuropsych-like approach to test interpretation, and as I mentioned previously, it's kind of beyond the scope of this lecture. We'll be talking about formal neuropsych testing towards the end of the semester, and I will try and bring back some of process analysis, but at this point it's pretty deep stuff and not what you would typically do in most kind of standard test interpretation for the WAIS. So important points here at the subtest level. Interpreting subtests can be important. For instance, strengths and weaknesses analysis are pretty common. You often see them. But you need specific reasons for your analyses, and you almost always need some guidance as to how to do them. That's especially the case if you're looking at subtest comparisons, because without those reasons and without that guidance, it's fairly easy to come up with weird speculative interpretations that may not be reliable or valid. Also worth noting, is what you really shouldn't be doing is giving your own kind of impressionistic interpretations of what subtest performance could mean. I mean, we encourage you to make observations and make notes, but be careful, because it's easy to dream up a reason why someone might do really poorly on block design but really well on coding. Unless you're a very experienced test user and have done this a lot, stick mostly with what you get from the test documentation and software, and that will be to your benefit and, more importantly, to your client's benefit. So, putting it all together, well, there's a lot to take in, and you can be forgiven for feeling kind of overwhelmed at this point. What I suggest you do, though, is kind of think about that sequence that we've been kind of walking through in this lecture. First, overall ability, then index level, and finally subtest level. So again, at the overall ability, it's almost always important to come up with some estimate of what someone's general ability is, overall ability, whether that's full scale IQ, general ability index, or maybe verbal comprehension index, depending. At an index level, it's important at least to describe what these indices are, and maybe describe discrepancies between them. So that's usually important. At a subtest level, it's fairly common to see strengths and weaknesses analysis. That's not always very important, though, and it's, at least in typical administration, scoring, and interpretation, it's rare to see much more than that. So again, at the overall level, choose the best index of overall ability. At the index level, characterize what those indices are and discuss meaningful discrepancies, not just statistically significant discrepancies, but ones that are significant, rare, and make sense for the client. And at the subtest level, characterize performance in terms of, different strengths and weaknesses. Maybe go beyond that, but probably not. So is the person, in this case, thinking about this one particular client, we have someone who probably has above average mental ability, especially before his accident, and we're going to consider probably using verbal comprehension index as the best indicator of his overall intellectual functioning, especially if we're trying to estimate sort of pre-morbid functioning. At the index level, it's pretty clear that he has deficits in perceptual reasoning and working memory. These deficits are large, they're statistically significant, they're rare in our standardization sample, and they make sense given the client's presentation. He's a person who's been successful academically and career-wise, but then he had a head injury, which we're going to assume based on the material that we're given has influenced his memory and his motor abilities. At a subtest level, we can see that the deficits are most evident on tasks that are heavy on motor ability and working memory demands. So he does the worst on block design because it's a task that requires it's a perceptual reasoning task, but it's kind of heavy on motor abilities, and it also requires a fair bit of working memory. And he's somewhat worse on coding than he is on symbol search because the working memory load's a little bit heavier on that task than it is on its counterpart in processing speed. So we're kind of characterizing why those discrepancies occur, and that's useful. Now, I'm not personally equipped to do a lot more than that, and I probably don't need to do a lot more than that at this point, unless I was trying to do some more kind of fine-grained neuropsych analysis, which thankfully for me and for you, given that we're pulling into almost an hour and a half here, we don't have to do. So again, remember, just as a last little bit of advice, the test is just one source of information. It should connect to other sources of information for a full and complete assessment. It's not just a one-off. We should have a little bit of a medical history on this person. We should have had an interview, maybe some other tests as well. And altogether, this is where the art meets the science. The trained clinician tries to form a picture that's not speculative, that is accurate to the person and a good representation of what we know and also what we don't know about his or her, in this case his, mental abilities. Gosh, thanks for your sustained attention. This was a long one, but I hope it was an interesting one, and if you're ever in a situation where you have to interpret a WAIS or indeed another Wechsler test, because they're pretty similar, if you follow these steps, I think you'll be well served. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.